The Consumer Product Safety Commission estimated 150,000 people required emergency room treatment annually for toy-related injuries in the 1970s alone. That is before you count the broken necks, the chemical fumes, or the hitchhiked rides. Here are 30 things Americans did for fun in the 70s that made absolutely no sense. Lawn darts were a fixture of the American backyard from the mid-1960s through the summer of 1988, a heavy steel spike with plastic fins hurled high in an arc toward a plastic ring on the grass. The game was supposed to require aim and patience. In practice, kids threw them straight up to see who would run last. Between 1978 and 1986, more than 6,100 people required emergency care. 3 children died. 7-year-old Michelle Snow was killed on April 5, 1987, in Riverside, California, when a dart thrown by a playmate drove through her skull. Her father, David, made 7 trips to Washington over the following 18 months, lobbying until regulators had no choice. The ban took effect in December of 1988. An 11-year-old girl in Tennessee fell into a coma from a lawn dart injury the very week Congress voted. The Consumer Product Safety Commission's parting instruction to the public: destroy any sets you still own. Millions of Americans had them stored in their garages. Clackers went by a remarkable number of names in the early 1970s. Curbangers, click-clacks, knockers, bonkers, and every version worked the same way. 2 hard acrylic balls hung from a string and a central ring. You put your finger through the ring, pumped your hand, and built momentum until the balls swung up and smacked together in a continuous arc. The sound was deeply satisfying. The hazard was not. The acrylic was brittle under repeated impact, and the balls shattered, not chipped, but exploded into sharp, high-velocity fragments at face level. Schools banned them not for the noise, but because kids were knocking each other unconscious. In 1976, the federal government filed United States versus article consisting of 50,000 cardboard boxes to seize an entire shipment. In 1985, the CPSC raided an Empire novelty warehouse in Phoenix and confiscated nearly 4,600 units, each box labeled shatterproof. After testing confirmed, the balls exploded on contact. Before most states thought to legislate the practice, riding in the open bed of a pickup truck was simply how you got places if a truck was going there. Kids piled in after Little League, after the hardware store, or for no reason except that the bed was open and the wind was good. The logic of the era held that if you held on and the driver did nothing sudden, you would be fine. What that logic left out was physics. A sudden stop at 35 miles per hour transferred the full momentum of an unrestrained body into open air and then into asphalt, with nothing between you and the road. Most states did not restrict truck bed passengers until the 1980s and the 1990s. The federal government never mandated a universal ban. It remains legal today in a number of states under certain conditions. The activity your parents treated as a summer treat technically never ended. America simply stopped thinking it was fun. Wham-O's slip and slide was a long yellow sheet of plastic that attached to a garden hose. And by the early 1970s, it was on every suburban block on hot days. For kids under about 100 pounds, it worked exactly as advertised. The danger was not in the toy. It was in the fact that the toy had no mechanism preventing adults from using it. When a full-grown body hits that thin plastic sheet at a run, the cervical spine decelerates differently than a child's does. Wham-O discontinued the product quietly in the late 1970s after serious injuries and lawsuits. The company revived it in 1982 under new ownership. Between 1973 and 1991, 7 adults and 1 13-year-old suffered neck injuries or paralysis. 1 early user died. The CPSC issued a warning in 1993 but never pulled it from shelves. Their stated reasoning was that children were not getting hurt. Only adults were getting hurt, and apparently adults were on their own. Wham-O's super elastic bubble plastic debuted in 1970, and the pitch was simple. Squeeze colorful goo onto a plastic straw, blow carefully, and watch a shimmering translucent balloon expand from the tip. Kids loved it. What the packaging omitted was that the goo consisted of polyvinyl acetate dissolved in ethyl acetate, the primary solvent in nail polish remover, plus additional industrial plasticizers. The fumes did not drift through the room. They concentrated inside the straw, directly at the point where the child inhaled. Prolonged sessions in a closed bedroom produced dizziness, headache, and involuntary muscle twitching. Kids discovered the finished bubbles could be lit on fire. They burned with a sharp chemical smell that left scorch marks on ceilings. Canada eventually banned the product. The United States never did. Wham-O discontinued it once the liability picture grew clear, without ever adding a warning label adequate to what young ones were actually inhaling every time they pressed the straw to their lips. Mattel's Creepy Crawlers Thingmaker was a toy that asked kids to pour liquid plastic called Plastigoop into metal bug-shaped molds, slide the tray into a small electric oven, and wait while it cooked at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The Plastigoop was marketed as non-toxic. That claim did not account for what polyvinyl chloride does when heated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. It releases chlorine gas and dioxin compounds into the room the child is sitting in. The metal molds conducted heat perfectly and retained it long after removal. Burns were not an occasional mishap. They were, by every account from the era, a standard feature of ownership. After repeated injury reports and growing scrutiny of the fumes, Mattel phased out the original oven version by the mid-1970s. The toy returned with safer heating elements in later decades. The original asked children to breathe burning PVC vapor, while reaching bare-handed toward metal trays that held their temperature like a cast-iron skillet fresh off a stove. The water wiggle connected to a garden hose and was supposed to flail around, spraying water while kids chased it across the yard. A chaotic, delightful summer toy on paper. It consisted of a 7-foot plastic hose attached to an aluminum water jet nozzle covered by a bell-shaped plastic head. The bell was the problem. In March of 1978, a 4-year-old boy in California was playing with a dismantled water wiggle, one from which the bell-shaped head had separated. The exposed aluminum nozzle became lodged in his mouth, and he drowned. Wham-O announced a voluntary recall the following month. It was not the first death. A 3-year-old boy had died in an identical manner in 1975, 3 years before the recall, while the product remained on shelves and the mechanism went unchanged. Wham-O stated publicly that it had no knowledge of why the toys were being dismantled, framing both deaths as misuse. The bell-shaped head came off because it was built to come off. The nozzle beneath it was solid exposed aluminum. 2 kids were dead before the product left stores. Riding a bicycle without a helmet in the 1970s was not considered reckless. It was simply how you rode, because the alternative had not entered mainstream consciousness. The helmet existed. Bell released the Biker 4, its first effective commercial cycling helmet with a polystyrene foam liner, in 1975. Almost nobody bought one. Kids rode down busy roads, across intersections, and off improvised plywood ramps, with nothing between their skulls and the pavement but optimism. No federal or state law required bicycle helmets for kids until the 1990s, by which point an entire generation had completed their formative years without one. The unspoken logic was that careful riders did not fall, and the ones who got hurt had been careless. What that logic could not absorb was the physics of a head contacting asphalt at speed, a force a properly fitted helmet reduces dramatically regardless of who was at fault. The kids who rode helmetless through the 1970s and emerged uninjured were lucky. The ones who cannot confirm this are simply not here. Hitchhiking was not a fringe activity in the 1970s. It was a standard, truly common method of transportation practiced by teenagers, college students, adults, and occasionally kids who had no other way across town. You stood at the roadside with your thumb out. A stranger stopped. You got in. The cultural assumption was that most people were decent, and the universe of bad outcomes was small enough to ignore. The concept of stranger danger, the organized public campaign warning young ones specifically about adults with unknown intentions, did not emerge until the early 1980s, driven by high-profile abduction cases that permanently shifted the national conversation. Before that shift, the math simply held that most strangers were harmless. Getting into an unlocked vehicle with someone you had never met, whose name you did not know, who would not be accountable to anyone for the next several hours, was considered a reasonable way to travel. Today, it is illegal on most major highways, and it is taught to children as precisely the thing they must never do. If hitchhiking was the era's trust exercise for the open road, the steel playground was its trust exercise on the block. Every public playground in the 1970s was built from heavy, angular, unpadded steel, anchored directly into asphalt or packed gravel. The slides were 12-foot sheets of raw metal that reached surface temperatures in direct summer sunlight, sufficient to brand skin in seconds. The merry-go-rounds were solid iron platforms that spun fast enough to generate real centrifugal force, with no lip, no grip surface, and nothing to prevent a child from leaving the edge at speed. Monkey bars rose 8 feet and 10 feet above concrete. Swing sets had exposed pinch points. The Consumer Product Safety Commission did not publish its first playground safety guidelines until 1981, and those guidelines were recommendations, not requirements. Rubber surfacing was not a standard expectation for years after that. The logic of the era held that falling taught consequences. The hospitals that treated the resulting fractures were, without exception, quite busy. Long before Tennessee passed the nation's first child passenger safety law in 1979, American children rode in cars in whatever position was comfortable, sprawled across the back seat, standing in the front footwell, or sitting on a parent's lap with no belt. Rear seat belts were optional equipment in many vehicles through the late 1960s, and even when present, they were rarely used. The popular belief held that a parent's arm thrown out during sudden braking was meaningful protection. At 30 miles per hour, the force transferred to an unrestrained child's body in a frontal impact equals a fall from a 3-story building, and a human arm has no mechanical advantage against that force. Federal standards for car seats existed on paper in the early 1970s. The last state to mandate child restraint laws did not act until 1986, more than a decade after the research was conclusive. During that gap, young passengers crossed state lines at highway speeds entirely unrestrained, and the adults in the front seat did not consider themselves reckless. In 1973, Ideal Toy Company released the Evel Knievel stunt cycle, and it became the must-have toy of the holiday season almost immediately. The concept was brilliant, a bendable 6-inch figure of America's most famous daredevil on a working miniaturized motorcycle, powered by a hand-cranked gyro launcher called the Energizer. You cranked as fast as you could, the gyro wheels spun up, and when you released it, Knievel shot out toward whatever ramp your imagination had placed in his path. Ideal later claimed the line generated more than $125 million across its production run. What the commercials did not linger on was the Energizer's crank mechanism, a spinning gear assembly requiring you to pull a T-bar through the housing at speed. If your hand slipped, if the angle was wrong, the gear teeth found the thin skin between your thumb and index finger. Scraped knuckles were so universal among owners that they functioned as a rite of passage. The toy was built around the premise that crashes were exciting. It delivered that premise personally to every kid who cranked the launcher. Kenner's SSP Racers launched in 1970 and became one of the decade's defining toy lines, a low-slung plastic race car powered by a serrated T-stick you jammed through a slot in the flywheel housing and ripped out as fast as your arm allowed. The flywheel spun at thousands of revolutions per minute. The car shot forward, and if you had done it right, it would travel 20 feet at speed. If you misjudged the angle or your grip slipped during the pull, the serrated edge found the webbing between your thumb and index finger. The cut was immediate and clean. Kenner sold the line for several years with no design modification to the T-stick, no handguard, and no warning about grip placement. The toy was never recalled. It was never redesigned in any meaningful way. It simply aged out of the market. The wound the T-stick produced became so universal among owners that kids passed the warning along, watch your hand on the pull. It was treated as useful information about a normal toy, not evidence of a design flaw. The Easy Bake Oven that Kenner sold through the 1970s was not the sealed, low-temperature appliance later generations knew. It was a metal-bodied unit heated by ordinary incandescent light bulbs, and it ran hot enough to cook batter, which meant it ran hot enough to cause serious burns to the hands inserting and removing pans. The opening slot was narrow. The metal walls conducted heat throughout the casing. The extraction rod was a thin metal stick with no insulation. A Hasbro redesign in 2006, addressing a newer front-loading model that had trapped and burned young fingers in its slot, resulted in a recall of nearly 1 million units and more than 200 reported burn injuries. The original Kenner version never generated a formal recall. It was phased out as technology changed. The burns it caused absorbed into the general category of childhood accidents rather than manufacturer liability. Two different companies, 2 different decades, the same fundamental problem, a heating appliance marketed to young kids with no adequate barrier between the heat source and the hand reaching in. If the Easy Bake Oven gave kids access to heat without protection, the chemistry sets of the same era handed them the actual periodic table. Gilbert, Porter, and Chemcraft all sold sets in the 1960s and 70s that contained real reactive compounds such as potassium permanganate, ammonium dichromate, and sodium thiosulfate. In some earlier sets, manufacturers even included uranium ore as a radioactivity demonstration. The fumes from standard experiments were not decorative. They were the real byproducts of chemical reactions taking place in a closed bedroom with no ventilation. Chemcraft sets sold through the early 1970s included acids capable of burning skin and compounds that produced toxic gas when combined. No protective goggles were included, and no fume hood came in the box. By the 1980s, the sets were reformulated significantly. The earlier versions were dangerous, simply the contents of a working laboratory repackaged for a 10-year-old with a closed door and no safety infrastructure whatsoever. Drinking from the garden hose on a hot afternoon was not a health decision in the 1970s. It was simply the most convenient water source when you were outside and thirsty, and the water tasted faintly of the hose, which everyone accepted as how outdoor water tasted. What that taste actually was: lead leaching from brass fittings, phthalates from the PVC hose lining, and in some cases, BPA from stabilizing compounds in the plastic. Garden hoses of the era were not manufactured with drinking in mind, and no regulation required them to be. A hose lying in direct sun all afternoon concentrated the chemical release. Drinking from one that had been sitting in a hot driveway meant drinking water that had been in contact with heated plastic and brass for hours. The FDA did not establish standards that made garden hoses safe to drink from until decades later. Many hoses sold today still carry a label warning they are not intended for drinking water. The ones sold in the 1970s carried no label at all. Everyone drank from them anyway, because the water was cold once it ran for a few seconds, and nobody had said not to. Wham-O's Air Blaster fired a concentrated pulse of compressed air when you squeezed the trigger. No projectile, no noise, just an invisible burst strong enough to knock over small objects from several feet away. The toy looked entirely harmless. That was the problem. The air pulse was also strong enough when aimed directly at the ear canal at close range to rupture an eardrum. This was not a theoretical scenario involving freak misuse. Kids pointed the air blaster at each other's ears because pointing toys at each other is what kids do. The documented result was barotrauma. With the eardrum perforated from a sudden pressure spike it was not designed to handle. Wham-O issued a voluntary recall after enough cases accumulated to make the mechanism undeniable. No federal mandate forced the action. The product had been marketed as a safe alternative to toy guns that fired visible projectiles. The selling point was that it shot nothing you could see. What it shot was pressure. Pressure does not need to be visible to do damage, and the ear is not selective about where sudden pressure comes from. Moon shoes arrived in the early 1970s as a pair of miniature trampolines strapped to your feet. They had metal frames with rubber band springs meant to give the wearer a small bounce with every step. The execution involved exposed metal frame edges at ankle height, rubber bands under tension that could snap and recoil when they broke, and a center of gravity that shifted unpredictably in a way that a developing ankle was not built to manage. Ankle fractures and sprains were common enough that the toy acquired an informal reputation in pediatric emergency departments. The original design was eventually discontinued. A redesigned version appeared in the 1990s with plastic frames and bungee cord springs, a quiet acknowledgement that the original architecture had been the problem. No recall of the 1970s version was ever issued. The original moon shoes aged out of production, taking their exposed metal spring edges and ankle injury record into the category of things that simply stopped being sold, with no official accounting of why. BB guns were sold to kids throughout the 1970s without age restrictions in most states, without mandatory safety training, and in many cases without any warning beyond the phrase on the box, "Do not aim at people." The Daisy Red Ryder lever action was familiar enough to be a cultural touchstone, and familiar enough that kids treated it with roughly the same casual regard as any other toy. Neighborhood BB gun wars, in which groups divided into sides and fired at each other from behind improvised cover, were common. The BB traveled between 300 and 400 feet per second, fast enough to penetrate skin at close range, fast enough to fracture teeth, fast enough to cause permanent eye damage at the right angle. BB gun injuries sent an estimated 20,000 Americans to emergency rooms annually by the mid-1970s. No federal law restricted their sale to minors until 1994, when the Child Safety Protection Act required age labeling. By then, the neighborhood BB wars of the 70s were simply a memory, filed under things that seemed normal at the time. And if the BB gun came with no federal age floor until 1994, the family sedan of the same era offered something equally unaddressed: the rear window shelf. Every American sedan of the 1960s and 70s had one, the narrow carpeted deck behind the back seat and beneath the rear windshield, flat enough that a small child could stretch out and sleep there on long drives. Parents placed their youngest ones on it to keep the back seat clear. The rear deck was structurally part of the trunk lid in most designs, with no padding beneath the carpet and no engineering designed to protect a body lying on it. In any rear-end collision or sudden stop, The child on that shelf became an unrestrained mass, with nothing between them and the front seats or the rear glass. There was no federal occupant protection standard for the rear deck. No automaker offered a restraint designed for it. That carpeted shelf had no margin for error built into it at all, and millions of American kids fell asleep on it every summer weekend. Minibikes were small gasoline motorcycles sold openly to kids throughout the 1970s. They were real motorized vehicles, sized for a child, available without a license, a test, or an age requirement at most retailers. They ran between 15 and 30 miles per hour on 3 to 5 horsepower engines, with no mandatory safety equipment and no license plate requirement in most states. Kids rode them on sidewalks, parking lots, neighborhood streets, and road shoulders with active traffic. Helmets were technically recommended, but almost never worn. No law required one. The CPSC estimated minibikes contributed substantially to roughly 125,000 motorcycle-related injuries treated in American emergency rooms annually by the mid-1970s, with a disproportionate share involving riders under 16. State legislatures addressed the issue inconsistently through the late 70s and 80s. A patchwork of local ordinances slowly pushed minibikes off public roads. No unified federal standard governing the sale of motorized vehicles to minors was ever established. The Johnny Reb cannon was a plastic artillery toy from Remco, sold through the 1970s. It was a wheeled Civil War field cannon replica that fired hard plastic balls across 15 to 20 feet with a spring-loaded mechanism. There was no minimum safe distance on the box, and no eye protection was recommended. The balls were hard enough to cause welts at close range, and at direct facial impact, they could damage an eye. What made it notable in the era's product history was that it was never recalled, not in the 60s, not in the 70s. Remco continued advertising it on television with footage of kids firing it directly at each other from a few feet away. The toy existed in a regulatory environment where no federal authority had clear jurisdiction to mandate a recall for a product whose designed function was to fire a hard projectile at a target that might, in practice, be another child's face. It was simply discontinued when it stopped selling. Nothing required anything more than that. Unsupervised all-day roaming was the dominant model of American childhood in the 1970s. You left after breakfast. You were expected back when the street lights came on. What happened in between was your business. The parks, the woods behind the subdivision, the drainage ditches, the railroad tracks, all of it was unmonitored. No adult was present to assess whether an activity had crossed from reckless into something worse. No communication mechanism existed if something went wrong. Child mortality. From unintentional injury dropped 48% between 1960 and 1990, a decline researchers attribute largely to car seats, pool fencing, and product recalls, not to supervised play. The unsupervised roaming simply continued. The injuries it produced were absorbed into the background noise of childhood, treated as normal and nobody's particular fault. Open construction sites were a standard feature of suburban expansion in the 1970s, and to the kids who lived in those subdivisions, they were the most interesting places in the neighborhood. Half-built houses had no doors, no windows, no barriers at stairwell openings that dropped 8 feet to concrete subfloors. Active sites stored lumber stacks with protruding nails, open trenches, exposed rebar, and equipment left unsecured overnight. No fencing was legally required in most jurisdictions. Kids treated construction sites as adventure playgrounds because they were better equipped than actual playgrounds, more complex, more hazardous, more interesting. OSHA's construction site standards, which arrived in force in the early 1970s, covered workers. They did not extend to the neighborhood kids who spent their afternoons inside the perimeter, and no separate framework addressed that gap until much later. But the construction site at least looked dangerous. The slip and slide looked like summer. Michael Hubert of Wisconsin was 32 years old in 1987 when he used one at a backyard party and broke his neck on impact. He was not an outlier. Between 1973 and 1991, 7 adults and 1 teenager suffered neck injuries from the product, injuries ranging from temporary paralysis to permanent quadriplegia. Wham-O had the injury data, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission had it too. The warning issued in 1993, 20 years after the first documented adult neck injury, was advisory only. The product remained on shelves. It remains on shelves today, packaged in the same cheerful yellow, because the box now includes a warning that adults should not use it. The warning is on the box. The product is unchanged. The lemon twist was a rigid plastic loop you placed around one ankle with a lemon-shaped weight that swung in a circle while you hopped over it with the other foot. It was a counting toy sold to kids as young as 4. The failure mode was elementary. When the rhythm broke and your hop was late, the rigid loop snapped against the ankle or shin of the standing leg with the full force of the swing. At speed, the hard plastic lemon could cause bruising, swelling, and, in documented cases, fractures of the smaller bones in the lower leg. No recall was ever issued. No design modification was made during the toy's production run. The lemon twist aged out of the market, its injury record distributed across pediatric offices nationwide without ever accumulating into a regulatory response. It was simply gone in a single year, and nobody asked why. Fireworks were sold to minors across most of the United States in the 1970s, with no federal age restriction and no adult supervision requirement at the point of sale. Available devices at roadside stands included M80s, cherry bombs, and bottle rockets, not just sparklers. Kids bought them with pocket money and set them off unsupervised in whatever configuration seemed most entertaining, which often included pointing them at each other and into enclosed spaces. The CPSC banned the most powerful consumer devices in 1976, removing M80s and cherry bombs from legal sale. Annual fireworks injuries still exceeded 10,000 cases through the late 1970s, even after the ban. The remaining legal devices were still capable of amputating fingers, igniting clothing, and destroying eyesight. They were still available to anyone who could reach the counter. Incredible Edibles was a Mattel toy from 1967 that used the exact same heating element and mold-based process as the Creepy Crawler's Thingmaker, with one distinguishing feature. The goo you cooked in it was marketed as food. You cooked plastic in a 350-degree oven and ate the result. Mattel called the formula Gobbledygook and argued it was technically distinct from Plastigoop, but it was heated in the same device, in the same metal molds, producing fumes in the same enclosed kitchen. Because Mattel successfully argued the product was legally a toy rather than a food, the Gobbledygook formula fell outside FDA jurisdiction entirely. Kids ate it anyway. The toy was discontinued in the early 1970s, not because of a recall or regulatory action, but because sales declined. What specifically kids had been ingesting was never formally answered before the product left the market. The swing bike had a second independent steering axis at the rear wheel that allowed the back half of the frame to pivot separately from the front, creating a wave-like motion that looked spectacular in promotional footage. Sold in the early 1970s as a novelty vehicle, it was marketed on the fluid movement that second axis produced. What the marketing did not address was the handling geometry. A conventional bicycle maintains stability through predictable front-wheel steering and a fixed rear frame. The swing bike's independent rear axis introduced unpredictable lateral forces that most young riders had no instinct to manage. At speed, the rear wheel could initiate its own steering input independent of the rider. There was no recall and no warning label about speed or experience. The swing bike vanished the way products whose failure mode is mechanical absurdity tend to vanish. Not with a regulatory action, but with a quiet recognition that nobody was successfully riding one. Shrinky Dinks were sheets of polystyrene plastic you colored, cut into shapes, and slid into a home oven at around 300 degrees Fahrenheit, where they shrank to 1/3 of their original size and hardened. The toy launched in 1973 and became one of the most widely sold craft toys of the decade. What the packaging did not address was what heated polystyrene releases, styrene vapor, a compound the National Toxicology Program later classified as reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. The kitchen oven used to shrink them was the same oven used to cook dinner, and the fumes dispersed through the house. The toy was not recalled. It was repackaged and remarketed through the 1980s and the 1990s, and it is still sold today. The current packaging recommends ventilation. The 1970s packaging did not. An entire generation baked carcinogen, releasing plastic in their family kitchens, called it an arts and crafts afternoon, and nobody said a word. The products changed. The pattern of knowing and waiting never did. If any of this was part of your childhood, leave a comment below.